Before the sun even thinks about rising, metal explodes against metal and jerks me awake, not a knock. A violent, echoing slam that rattles the steel gate at the end of my gravel drive. I drag on my boots and hurry through the cold morning air, expecting an accident or a stranded driver. Instead, I find 3 strangers in matching polo shirts and a woman in a pastel blazer standing beside a golf cart like they've arrived to inspect a crime scene. She doesn't greet me. She announces violations: smoke nuisance, property non-compliance, legal consequences. I stare at her, still half asleep, trying to understand why she's reciting rules from a neighborhood I don't even live in. She slides a cream envelope through the bars stamped "Final Notice." Another man lifts his phone and starts photographing my trees, my fence, my land, like evidence already decided. The confusion drains out of me, and something colder replaces it. They are not mistaken. They are claiming control. I refuse the envelope. The woman smiles thinly and says the board will handle it officially. The cart hums away, leaving dust and drifting smoke behind. I stand there realizing someone has already decided these 500 acres belong to them. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I bought the land the year I retired, not because I wanted to disappear from the world, but because I wanted a quieter version of it. 500 acres of longleaf pine, sandy soil, and open sky felt like space to breathe after decades of blueprints, deadlines, and fluorescent office lights. The first months were simple in a way life rarely is. I walked the boundaries with an old survey map folded in my back pocket. I cleared brush piles left by previous owners. I planted rows of young saplings that would still be standing long after I was gone. Most mornings, the only sound was wind sliding through needles or a woodpecker tapping somewhere deep in the trees. Silence there did not feel empty. It felt earned. On the eastern edge of my property sat Briarwood Estates, a subdivision so neat it almost looked artificial. Identical houses lined up in perfect rows. Identical mailboxes. Identical driveways curving like mirrored shapes. At first, the people seemed pleasant enough. When I drove the dirt access road, some of them waved from porches. A few stopped near the fence and asked about the pines with genuine curiosity. I assumed we would exist beside each other without much overlap. Close neighbors geographically, strangers practically. The first odd moment was small enough to laugh off. A glossy flyer appeared in my roadside mailbox addressed simply to "Resident." It welcomed me to the Briarwood community and listed rules about lawn height, exterior paint colors, and garbage can placement. I remember shaking my head and tossing it onto the truck seat, thinking someone had mixed up addresses. My land was older than their entire subdivision. The county records were clear, but the small moments kept repeating. One afternoon, I noticed a golf cart parked along the public shoulder with 2 people taking photos of my fence line. They waved when I approached and claimed they were documenting views. Another evening, a young couple walking their dog paused to chat and mentioned, almost apologetically, that the HOA president liked control. The way they said it was not joking or dramatic. Just tired. Still, I dismissed it. Every neighborhood has someone who enjoys rules more than people. That did not make them my problem. Life on the track stayed peaceful. I spent afternoons marking new walking trails with bright ribbon, checking soil moisture, and watching hawks circle overhead. During the summer, my niece visited and called the place the Whisper Forest because every breeze made the trees murmur like distant rain. The subdivision remained a quiet backdrop of trimmed hedges and synchronized porch lights blinking on at the same hour each evening. Their order felt distant, almost decorative. One night, more out of habit than concern, I spread the county plat maps across my kitchen table. Thick boundary lines showed my property ending well beyond Briarwood's jurisdiction. Straight measurements. Simple geometry. Facts that left no room for interpretation. The earlier incidents shrank in my mind, reduced to harmless misunderstandings destined to fade with time. They did not fade. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped into the same roadside mailbox that once held the welcome flyer. This envelope was heavier, cream-colored, stamped with a formal seal that looked more governmental than it had any right to be. Inside were violation codes, fee amounts, and deadlines written in confident legal language. Smoke nuisance. Visual disorder. Immediate compliance required. Late fees already listed. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the mistake to reveal itself. My name was spelled correctly. The property description was accurate. The tone was not confused or polite. It was certain. That was the moment unease stopped being abstract. This was not a mix-up. It was intention. The neat rows of identical houses beyond my eastern fence suddenly felt less like neighbors and more like a system with reach. Outside my window, the pines were still whispering, the same as always, but something rigid and territorial had just crossed an invisible line and stepped onto my land. I sat at my kitchen table with that first notice in front of me and tried to make it make sense. The paper looked official on purpose. Heavy stock. Clean typography. A seal pressed into the corner like it carried weight. The language was written the way people write when they want you to feel small. Violation. Enforcement. Penalty. Final. 2 days later, it wasn't one notice anymore. A second cream-colored envelope showed up, then a third, each one stacking new accusations onto the last, like bricks. Smoke nuisance. Visual disorder. Non-compliant fencing. I actually laughed out loud when I read that one, because my fence on the east side was a standard boundary barrier built for a timber tract, not a backyard. I owned forest, not a lawn. But the laugh died when I saw the numbers. Late fees had already been added. Interest was already calculated. They had created a past due balance out of thin air. That was when I decided I was done assuming this was some clerical error. I drove into Briarwood Estates for the first time on purpose. The neighborhood felt even stranger from inside. Every yard trimmed to the same height, the same shade of green. Porch decorations like they were selected from the same store catalog. The streets were clean enough to look staged. At the center sat a small office building and clubhouse, beige stucco with a stone sign out front that announced Briarwood Estates Community Association, like it was a courthouse. I parked and walked to the door with my folder of documents under my arm. County plat maps, deed paperwork, burn permit approvals, the kind of paper that usually ends arguments before they begin. The door was locked. Behind the glass, a receptionist sat at a desk and glanced up. I could see her eyes flick to my folder, then to me, and then away again like she already knew what this was. I knocked. She stood, walked to the door, and didn't open it. Instead, she spoke through the glass. "Do you have an appointment?" "I got violation notices," I said, keeping my voice even. "They're not valid." "I don't live here." Her face stayed neutral, practiced. "You'll need to speak with the board president." "Great," I said. "I'd like to do that now." She disappeared down a hallway. A minute later, a woman appeared behind the glass door like she'd been waiting in the shadows. Evelyn Carrington. She wore a crisp blouse and slacks, hair smoothed back as if a single stray strand would offend her. She didn't open the door either. She stood on the other side of the glass like a museum display and looked at me the way people look at a stain on white carpet. "You've been notified," she said, her voice muffled by the door. "I've been harassed," I corrected. "My property is not part of your association. Here are the plat maps. Here's the deed. Here are the county permits for my controlled burns." I lifted the folder so she could see the county seal. She didn't lean in. She didn't ask to read it. She didn't ask a single question that suggested she cared what the truth was. "Compliance is mandatory," she said. "You border our community. Your actions affect our residents." "I manage timber," I said, feeling my jaw tighten. "That's not a violation. That's my livelihood and my land." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "Smoke drifting into Briarwood is a nuisance. Unkempt land is a nuisance. We have standards, and I am not under them." She gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, like she'd heard that line before and already decided how it ended. "You can appeal through the proper process," she said. "But the notices stand." Then she turned and walked away without another word. I stood there for a long second staring at my own reflection in the glass, folder clutched in my hands, feeling something hot rise in my chest and then settle into something colder and steadier. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a power play. A woman who couldn't stand the idea of something beyond her reach. As I walked back toward my truck, I noticed a couple standing near the clubhouse steps. They looked like they were waiting for someone, but their attention was on me. The man was young, athletic build, wearing work boots. The woman held a leash with a small dog pulling at the end, impatient to get moving. When I passed, she leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "You're the timber guy," she said. "I guess I am," I answered. The man glanced toward the glass door and then back at me. "That's Evelyn," he said quietly, like speaking her name too loudly might summon her. "She finds everyone." "For what?" I asked. The woman gave a humorless laugh. "For breathing wrong. We got a notice last month because our trash can was visible from the street for 10 minutes after pickup." The man nodded. "She likes control," he added, eyes flat. "If she thinks she can pull you under her rules, she'll try." "What are your names?" I asked. "Oliver Bennett," he said. "This is Grace." Grace tightened her grip on the leash. "Be careful," she said. "She doesn't stop when she starts." I drove home with their warning echoing in my head, and for the first time I felt something worse than annoyance. I felt the edge of a threat. For a few days, I tried the reasonable route anyway. I mailed copies of my plat maps and deeds to the HOA office certified. I included county documentation showing my burn plans were approved and supervised. I wrote a short letter stating clearly that my property was outside their jurisdiction and that further contact would be considered harassment. Evelyn responded with silence. But the envelopes kept coming. Then the conflict stopped being paper. It happened late morning, 4 days after my certified letter. I was checking a trail near the east boundary when I heard the low rumble of a truck on the public road. Not unusual. Logging trucks and county vehicles pass sometimes. But this one slowed near my property line. I moved closer and saw a white pickup with a surveying company logo on the door. 2 men climbed out with tripods and bright orange stakes. They didn't just measure along the road. They walked straight onto my dirt access path like they belonged there. I waited long enough to be sure. They pushed a stake into the sandy soil near the start of my trail and began lining up measurements deeper into my land. My pulse thudded hard, not from fear but from shock at the audacity. I stepped out from behind the trees and called out. "Hey," I said, voice sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" Both men startled. One raised his hand slightly, as if to show he wasn't trying to cause trouble. "Survey work," he said quickly. "We've got a job order." "On my property," I said. "Who hired you?" He hesitated, then held out a clipboard. "Community Association," he said. "They said there's a community access easement here, historical use." My stomach dropped in a slow, heavy way. An easement. That word could turn into a permanent wound if it was allowed to sink in. I took the clipboard and scanned the paperwork. There it was in black ink, clean and confident. Work order authorized by Briarwood Estates Community Association. Attached map. Intended line of survey. And at the bottom, a signature. Evelyn Carrington. I pulled my phone out and photographed the document from 3 angles, making sure the signature was clear. Then I photographed the stakes, the trail, the truck, the men standing on my land. "I'm going to be very clear," I said, handing the clipboard back. "There is no easement. This is private property." "You are trespassing." The surveyor swallowed. "We were told." "You were lied to," I said. "Pull the stakes and leave. Right now. Or I call the sheriff and you explain to them why you're marking lines on someone else's land." The 2 men looked at each other, and I could see the calculation happening. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want their company name tied to a trespass report. Slowly, without argument, they started yanking the stakes back out of the ground. As they loaded their gear, one of them tried one last time to soften it. "Sorry, sir," he said. "We just do the work." "I know," I answered, "but you're done here." When the truck finally rolled away, the silence felt different. The trees still whispered, but now it sounded like warning. Back inside my house, I cleared my table and set the notices in a neat pile. I punched holes in every letter, every envelope, every document. I printed the photos of the survey stakes and the work order. I printed the certified mail receipt. I printed my burn permits, my deeds, my plat maps. Then I opened a thick, heavy-duty binder and wrote a label across the spine in bold black marker. Operation Fence Line. Because if Evelyn Carrington wanted to fight with paper and false authority, I was done trying to be polite. From that moment on, every move she made would be recorded, dated, and turned into the one thing she could not control. Proof. The envelope stopped feeling like mail and started feeling like warnings. They arrived every few days, always the same cream color, always heavier than they needed to be, always written in language that sounded like it had already judged me guilty. The accusations changed slightly each time, but the tone never did. Smoke nuisance. Environmental hazard. Property disorder. Each notice carried new numbers, new deadlines, new threats of further action. It was as if someone sat in an office inventing problems just to see which one might finally scare me into folding. I began stacking them on my kitchen counter instead of opening them immediately. The pile grew fast enough to be visible from the doorway. That visibility was the point. It reminded me this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. The next escalation wasn't paper. It was reputation. Oliver sent me a photo one evening from his phone. A community bulletin board inside the Briarwood clubhouse had a printed notice pinned dead center. My name wasn't listed, but the description left no room for doubt. Nearby property owner creating fire risk. Residents advised to report smoke or suspicious activity. The words were careful enough to avoid direct accusation, but sharp enough to plant fear. Beneath it, someone had scribbled a question in pen. Why is he allowed to keep doing this? I stared at the photo longer than I expected. Not because I cared what strangers thought, but because I understood the strategy. If she couldn't control my land, she could try to control how people saw me. Within a week, I felt the shift. When I drove past the subdivision entrance, heads turned. Conversations paused. Porch waves disappeared. The same people who had once nodded politely now watched me like I was a moving problem. Nothing had changed about my work, my permits, or my land. Only the narrative had changed. Then the county truck showed up. 2 inspectors stepped out with clipboards and neutral expressions. I recognized the look immediately. Not hostile, just procedural. Someone had filed a complaint. They walked my burn lines, checked my permits, examined the fire breaks I'd carved months earlier. Every document I handed them matched the regulations exactly. One of them even complimented the thoroughness of my preparation. "You're well within compliance," he said finally. "This complaint shouldn't have escalated this far." He closed his clipboard, shook my hand, and drove away. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt watched. That night, I reviewed the security camera feeds more than once before going to bed. Sleep came in fragments. Every distant engine sound pulled me halfway awake. The piece I'd bought this land for had developed an edge, like silence waiting for something to break it. A few mornings later, I walked the eastern boundary and noticed one of the bright orange ribbons I used to mark trail lines hanging loose. When I moved closer, I saw the cut was clean. Not weathered, not torn by wind. Sliced. Someone had stepped onto my land and decided to alter it, even if only by a strip of plastic. It was small, almost childish, but that was what made it effective. It wasn't damage. It was intrusion. Proof that someone believed they could cross the line without consequence. Oliver called me that afternoon, voice tight. "They're fining us now," he said. "For what?" "For our dog barking near your fence. They say it's a disturbance tied to the ongoing hazard situation." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the pattern settle into place. This wasn't just pressure aimed at me anymore. It was collateral. Anyone who stood too close was being nudged back into silence. Oliver wasn't angry. He was tired. Grace, he told me, was already talking about just paying it to avoid trouble. That was the mechanism Evelyn relied on, not law. Fatigue. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. Folding chairs lined the room in neat rows. I kept to the back, binder under my arm, waiting for the right moment. When the floor opened for community concerns, I raised my hand. Evelyn noticed immediately. Her expression hardened before I even spoke. "This meeting is for residents," she said, voice carrying across the room. "Non-members do not have speaking privileges." "I'm here because your notices involve my property," I replied evenly. "And your funds were used to send surveyors onto my land." A murmur moved through the chairs. Evelyn didn't let it grow. "This individual has been repeatedly hostile toward our community," she announced, turning to the room instead of me. "We have attempted cooperation. He has chosen aggression." It was so smooth I almost admired it. She reframed my presence as threat instead of defense. A few residents shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The moment passed, the agenda moved on, and I sat back down with my binder still closed, realizing she didn't fear facts. She feared them being heard. The emotional toll crept in quietly after that. Nights stretched longer. I found myself checking camera feeds before making coffee. My mind replayed conversations I hadn't even had yet. Anger simmered low and constant, not explosive, just present. The land still looked the same trees, the same trails, the same open sky, but the feeling of solitude had been replaced by vigilance. Peace had been replaced by readiness. The final envelope arrived late on a Friday afternoon. It wasn't cream this time. It was stark white, thicker, stamped with legal formatting that wanted to be intimidating. Inside was a letter suggesting potential legal action for encroachment onto community boundaries. I read that line twice, then a third time, waiting for the absurdity to collapse under its own weight. I owned the original tract. Their subdivision had been built decades later. They were accusing the land itself of moving. I didn't laugh. I set the letter on the table beside the binder and looked at the growing stack of documentation. Notices, photos, inspection clearances, survey paperwork. Every move Evelyn had made was recorded in neat order. For the first time since this started, something clicked into place with perfect clarity. She wasn't trying to win legally. She was trying to exhaust me into submission. The intimidation wasn't meant to be correct. It was meant to be relentless. Letters, whispers, inspections, public boards, collateral fines, small intrusions, larger threats. Not one of them decisive on its own, but together forming pressure that most people would eventually yield to just to make it stop. I closed the binder and rested my hand on its spine, feeling the weight of paper that had once annoyed me and now armed me. This was never about law. It was about control. The shift did not happen during a confrontation. It happened quietly, almost by accident, the way most turning points do. I was at the small hardware store just outside the county line, buying replacement ribbon and fence staples, when an older woman studying seed packets glanced at the binder tucked under my arm and said, almost casually, "You're the one they're sending letters to." I looked up, surprised. Her tone wasn't curious. It was knowing. "That obvious?" I asked. She gave a small smile. "Only if you've seen that color envelope enough times." We ended up standing near the gardening aisle longer than either of us expected. Her name was Lydia Hawthorne. She spoke calmly, the way people do when they're used to numbers making sense even when people don't. It turned out she had once been the HOA's treasurer, years before Briarwood filled out its last few streets. She didn't say she quit. She said she left when the math stopped adding up. That phrasing stayed with me. We sat at a small bench outside the store where the afternoon sun warmed the concrete. Lydia didn't gossip. She laid things out like ledger entries. The contingency fund had grown unusually large under Evelyn's leadership. Vendor payments often lacked itemized invoices. Legal retainers went to the same attorney repeatedly, sometimes for vague consultation without clear case references. Landscaping budgets ballooned despite no visible upgrades. The pattern wasn't chaos. It was selective spending disguised as routine operations. "You don't spend that way by accident," Lydia said, folding her hands. "You spend that way when you don't expect anyone to question it." I felt something settle into focus that had been blurry until that moment. The notices, the surveyors, the intimidation, they weren't just personal. They were funded. Someone was approving those checks. Someone was labeling those expenses. "Why tell me this?" I asked. She looked at the binder again. "Because you're documenting. Most people just pay. You're cataloging." A week later, Lydia invited me to her home. It was modest, organized, the kind of place where paperwork had designated drawers and nothing was misplaced. She didn't hand me secrets. She handed me process. Public records access points, meeting minutes archives, financial summaries that residents were technically allowed to review if they knew where to look and how to ask. I spent the next several nights not in the woods, but at my kitchen table with spreadsheets open and receipts printed. Patterns emerged quickly once I knew what to search for. A payment labeled Community Beautification matched the exact amount billed by the surveying company that had stepped onto my land. Legal retainers appeared in clusters around the same weeks violation notices were mailed. Printing expenses traced back to a small vendor whose ownership matched Evelyn's extended family. The realization didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as clarity. This was no longer a boundary dispute. It was financial leverage disguised as governance. The survey truck wasn't just an intrusion, it was an invoice. The letters weren't just threats, they were budget lines. My irritation evaporated and left something steadier in its place. I wasn't defending land anymore. I was exposing a system. The binder changed shape after that. It stopped being chronological and started becoming structural. Sections emerged. Financial timelines, vendor cross-references, photographic evidence aligned with transaction dates. Lydia helped me translate columns of numbers into simple visuals any resident could understand. Bars rising, lines intersecting, colors separating categories of spending. The story stopped being mine and started becoming theirs, their dues, their funds, their board. Emotionally, the shift was noticeable even to me. The sleepless nights didn't vanish, but they changed flavor. Instead of replaying confrontations, I rehearsed presentations. Instead of checking cameras every hour, I checked figures twice. Anger gave way to focus. I stopped thinking about Evelyn as an adversary and started thinking about her as an entry in a chart, a variable that could be explained, not feared. Lydia never pushed. She simply reviewed my work and occasionally circled a number with a pen. "This one needs context," she would say. Or, "That line will speak for itself." Her confidence wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and unshakable, the kind built from decades of reconciling columns until they balanced or exposed themselves. The most striking discovery was how ordinary the concealment was. There were no secret offshore accounts or dramatic embezzlement. It was subtler than that. Small approvals stacked over time, minor budget shifts repeated until they became large. The kind of misuse that thrives not on secrecy, but on boredom, on the assumption that no one wants to read line items closely. One evening, as I finished assembling the final charts, I stepped outside onto the porch and listened to the forest. The trees sounded the same as they always had, but I felt different standing among them. For weeks I had been reacting. Now I was preparing. The conflict had moved from emotion to procedure, from confrontation to exposure. The annual HOA meeting date was already posted on the Briarwood Community Board. I printed it and slid it into the front sleeve of the binder. The presentation took shape not as a speech, but as a sequence. Boundary proof first. Financial cross-references second. Vendor links third. Survey payment highlighted last. Simple, undeniable, chronological. I realized then that the most effective weapon in this entire situation wasn't anger or even law. It was transparency delivered at the right moment. The night before the meeting, I sat at the table with the binder open and the projector packed beside it. The pages were no longer just documentation. They were narrative. Every letter, every receipt, every timestamp told the same story from a different angle. The intimidation campaign that once felt personal now looked mechanical, predictable, and, most importantly, explainable. I closed the binder and rested my hand on its cover for a long second. The fear that had hovered at the beginning of this had burned away entirely. In its place was something almost calm. Because, for the first time since the pounding on the gate, I wasn't walking into their space to defend myself. I was walking in to let them answer to their own neighbors. The plan did not begin with a dramatic announcement or a rallying speech. It began with quiet conversations and careful timing. By the time I understood the financial patterns, I also understood something else just as important. Facts alone would not change anything unless other voices echoed them. One person presenting documents could be dismissed as disgruntled. Several people speaking at once became a pattern too loud to ignore. Oliver and Grace were the first to sit at my kitchen table with the binder open between us. Their dog curled under the chair, unaware that his barking had been converted into a violation code somewhere in an office ledger. Grace looked at the charts longer than I expected. Oliver leaned forward with his elbows on the table, scanning dates and amounts like he was memorizing them. I didn't ask them to fight. I asked them to tell the truth if they were already tired of being quiet. "We don't want trouble," Grace said softly. "You already have it," I replied. "You're just paying for it." Oliver exhaled through his nose and nodded once. Not dramatic, just decided. Thomas Reed came next, introduced by Oliver a few days later. He was a Marine veteran with the kind of posture that didn't fade even after years out of uniform. His dispute had started with something almost symbolic, a flagpole 2 feet taller than the association allowed. The letters he'd received were written with the same language I recognized from my own notices: firm, rehearsed, designed to intimidate without technically threatening. When I showed him the financial entries tied to legal retainers and printing campaigns, his jaw tightened. "So this is what our dues are buying," he said. "It's what they're funding," I answered. He didn't hesitate. "I'll speak." Lydia became the quiet backbone behind the scenes. She didn't attend meetings or stand at podiums. She supplied transaction logs, clarified discrepancies, and helped refine the visuals so they could be understood in seconds rather than minutes. She treated every figure like a brick in a wall, placed carefully, aligned precisely, impossible to knock down once set. While the conversations grew, I turned my attention back to the boundary itself. Cameras went up along the eastern trail, angled to capture the dirt road and the areas where ribbon had been cut. I didn't expect dramatic footage. I expected confirmation. 2 nights later, the confirmation arrived. A figure stepping onto the trail after midnight, phone lights sweeping the ground, lingering near the marker stakes that no longer existed. The person didn't damage anything. They didn't need to. Their presence alone proved intent. I archived the clip with a timestamp and placed it printed still into the binder. The small victories accumulated quietly. A resident named Maria slipped Oliver copies of violation notices she'd been too embarrassed to contest. Another neighbor forwarded emails showing Evelyn dismissing legitimate questions with curt one-line responses. None of these pieces were explosive by themselves, but together they formed texture. They showed that the pressure wasn't isolated, it was systemic. The cat and mouse tension sharpened as the meeting date approached. Evelyn's confidence became visible even from a distance. New notices appeared on the community board praising continued enforcement efforts and warning of increased penalties for non-compliance. She was tightening her grip at the exact moment it was beginning to slip. Fear had worked for her before. She believed it would work again. Then the announcement went out. A special assessment meeting scheduled for the same evening as the annual gathering. The notice framed it as routine budget adjustment. The numbers attached were anything but routine. Residents would be asked to contribute additional funds to cover unexpected administrative expenses. I recognized the timing immediately. She was moving money before questions could surface, assuming no one would connect the dots. Instead, the announcement became the hinge of the plan. I adjusted the presentation sequence so the financial charts followed the boundary proof and preceded the survey payment. The special assessment would be addressed directly, not emotionally, but mathematically. Lydia helped refine the graphs until even a glance revealed the imbalance. Oliver and Grace rehearsed their statements at my table, reading them aloud until their voices steadied. Thomas practiced once, then closed his notebook and said he was ready. His confidence didn't come from memorization. It came from conviction. The nights grew shorter, not because I slept less, but because the hours felt compressed by anticipation. Every camera check confirmed nothing new, which was exactly what I wanted. Stability. Evidence already secured. No surprises left to uncover. The forest outside remained unchanged, but my relationship to it shifted again. It was no longer a place I was guarding. It was a place I was representing, A week before the meeting, we synchronized the sequence. Who would speak first? Who would follow? What document would be shown when? No grand gestures. Just order. The strength of the plan wasn't volume. It was alignment. Each voice connected to the next like sections of the same sentence. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued acting as if silence were guaranteed. Her emails to residents became shorter, more directive. Notices emphasized deadlines instead of explanations. Overconfidence has a distinct rhythm to it. Quick, efficient, blind to the possibility of interruption. She believed fear was still the dominant currency. She never imagined transparency would enter the room. The final days were spent printing. Charts, still frames from camera footage, copies of notices, transaction summaries. The printer hummed late into the night while pages stacked neatly beside the binder. I labeled tabs with clean, bold lettering so nothing required searching. Every question I anticipated had an answer already placed behind a divider. The evening before the meeting, Oliver called to confirm their arrival time. Thomas texted a simple message, "I'm in." Lydia reviewed the last spreadsheet and replied with a single word, "Balanced." It was the closest she came to encouragement, and it was enough. I placed the final charts into their sleeves, closed the binder, and set it beside the projector case. For the first time since the first envelope arrived, the tension in my chest felt different. Not anxious. Not angry. Focused. Multiple voices. Multiple documents. One moment. All synchronized for the same night. The clubhouse lights were brighter than they needed to be, washing the beige walls in a flat glow that made everything feel staged. Folding chairs filled quickly, residents drifting in with the relaxed posture of people expecting routine announcements and budget updates. Conversations floated in small clusters. Lawn maintenance, parking rules, weekend plans. No one arrived expecting confrontation. That was the advantage of preparation. Surprise belongs to the person who knows the moment is coming. Evelyn sat at the long table at the front of the room with the rest of the board arranged beside her like a line of silent endorsements. Her posture was relaxed, hands folded neatly over a printed agenda. She wore the same expression she always wore in public settings, patient, measured, as if the room existed to confirm her authority rather than question it. The board members beside her shuffled papers and checked phones, unaware that the evening script was already outdated. When I stepped through the doors carrying the binder in one hand and the projector case in the other, the first reaction wasn't hostility. It was curiosity. A ripple of whispers moved through the chairs like wind through tall grass. People glanced back, then forward again, unsure whether my presence meant anything at all. I walked to the side wall and set my equipment down without haste. The calmness was intentional. Anxiety draws attention. Composure invites observation. From the back row, Thomas caught my eye and gave a small nod. Not encouragement. Confirmation. Oliver and Grace sat near the center, their hands briefly touching before separating as if rehearsed. Lydia wasn't there physically, but her work sat neatly inside the binder, every number aligned and ready. The room felt ordinary on the surface, but underneath it was tension stretched thin, waiting for weight. Evelyn began the meeting with practiced efficiency. She thanked residents for attendance, reviewed minor agenda points, and delivered updates in a tone that suggested progress without inviting questions. The cadence was smooth, the kind that lulls listeners into passive agreement. Every sentence carried the subtle implication that order was being maintained because she was maintaining it. When the time came for public comments, her eyes flicked briefly toward me before scanning the room. She lifted the gavel slightly and spoke before anyone else could. "This portion of the meeting is reserved for residents only," she said. "We ask that non-members respect the process." The statement was aimed at me without naming me. A few heads turned again. I stood, not abruptly, but with the measured pace of someone who had anticipated the line. "I'm here because association funds have been used in actions involving my property," I said evenly. "The bylaws allow external speakers when financial matters affect non-members." Silence settled for a second. Not long, but long enough for attention to sharpen. Evelyn's smile thinned. She knew the clause existed. She also knew ignoring it would draw more attention than honoring it. "We'll allow brief remarks," she replied, each word deliberate. I nodded once and sat back down. The exchange was small, almost procedural, but it shifted the room's energy. The wire tightened. Evelyn resumed her agenda, though the rhythm had changed. Her updates became shorter, transitions quicker. She moved to budget discussions sooner than expected, presenting figures that sounded balanced but avoided specifics. A chart appeared on the projector behind her. Clean lines, rounded totals, nothing detailed enough to invite scrutiny. Residents nodded politely, absorbing the presentation the way people absorb weather forecasts they assume will not affect them directly. I checked my phone discreetly. The boundary cameras were live. The files were queued. Every document was exactly where it needed to be. The preparation felt less like readiness and more like inevitability, as if the sequence had already occurred somewhere and I was merely catching up to it. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, the only visible sign of anticipation. Oliver leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Grace kept her gaze fixed ahead, breathing steady. Around them, conversations had faded into attentive quiet. The atmosphere no longer felt routine, it felt suspended. Evelyn's tone sharpened as she reached the final item on her agenda. She spoke about unexpected administrative expenses and the necessity of maintaining standards. The words were familiar, but now they carried urgency. She emphasized community responsibility, shared burden, the importance of unity. It was rhetoric designed to close ranks before questions could open gaps. Then she introduced the special assessment. Numbers appeared on the screen, rounded, simplified, presented as unavoidable. A collective murmur rolled through the room, low and uncertain. People shifted in their seats. The comfort that had filled the first minutes of the meeting dissolved into cautious calculation. Evelyn raised the gavel slightly, preparing to call the vote before hesitation could solidify into dissent. In that brief pause, the room held its breath. I stood, binder in one hand, projector remote in the other. The movement was quiet, but it cut through the air like a line drawn across paper. Evelyn's eyes met mine, and for the first time that evening, her expression changed. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition. She opened her mouth to proceed with the vote, and I was already walking forward, evidence in hand, ready to interrupt the narrative she had spent months constructing. The room did not erupt immediately. It tightened first, like a breath held too long. I stepped beside the projector and set the binder on the table with a quiet thud that sounded louder than it should have. Evelyn's gavel hovered mid-air, her sentence unfinished. The board members looked from her to me and back again, unsure which direction authority was about to move. "I'll be brief," I said, my voice steady enough that it surprised even me. "But I'll be clear." The first image I projected was not financial. It was a county plat map. Thick, black boundary lines filled the screen, clean and undeniable. My tract sat outside Briarwood's jurisdiction by a distance that could not be argued away with interpretation or opinion. The map wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was geometry, and geometry does not negotiate. A ripple of murmurs moved through the chairs. Heads tilted. People leaned forward. Evelyn's expression remained composed, but her posture stiffened slightly, the first visible crack. I clicked to the next slide. Financial charts replaced the map. Columns and dates aligned beside transaction labels. Landscaping budgets, legal retainers, contingency funds. Then the highlighted line. A payment labeled Community Beautification matched exactly with the invoice from the surveying company that had stepped onto my land. The amount was identical down to the cent. The date aligned with the morning stakes appeared on my trail. The murmurs turned sharper. Questions began forming out loud instead of in whispers. Evelyn stood. "These figures are being taken out of context," she said quickly. "Administrative expenses are..." "Context is on the next slide," I replied, advancing the screen. Email timestamps appeared. Vendor connections. Invoice summaries. The structure of the spending became visible, not as isolated incidents, but as a pattern. The room shifted again, this time with weight behind it. It wasn't outrage yet. It was recognition. From the side aisle, Lydia stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I managed those accounts for 3 years," she said. Those entries were never itemized while I was treasurer. They are now being categorized differently, but the totals speak for themselves. Her tone carried the quiet authority of someone who had balanced thousands of ledgers without error. No one interrupted her. No one laughed. The numbers on the screen backed her words with silent precision. Thomas rose next from the back row, holding a folded stack of papers. He walked to the aisle, unfolded one, and read a single paragraph aloud, a letter threatening penalties over a flagpole height. Another followed, then another, each stamped with the same letterhead and the same language. The repetition wasn't dramatic. It was mechanical, revealing intimidation not as an exception but as a process. Oliver stood without notes. "We paid fines for things that weren't violations," he said, "because arguing felt like more trouble than it was worth." Grace nodded beside him, her silence reinforcing the point more effectively than words. The room turned. Not slowly, not cautiously. It pivoted as a single organism, realizing the floor beneath it had shifted. Conversations broke out in clusters. Hands lifted, voices overlapped. Evelyn attempted to regain control, striking the gavel twice, but the sound no longer carried authority. It sounded small. I waited until the noise crested, then advanced to the final slide. A simple figure appeared in bold numbers, the cost of the survey that had placed stakes on my land. I turned back to the room. If this expenditure was valid, I said evenly, then the special assessment should cover it directly. Tonight. In full. If it wasn't valid, then the funds should be accounted for and returned. It was a trap built from arithmetic, not accusation. Support the assessment and admit the survey was official. Reject it and admit the spending was unjustified. There was no path that allowed denial to survive both directions. The room erupted. Questions flew toward the board faster than Evelyn could answer them. Why wasn't this disclosed? Who approved the invoice? Why were we fined for this? The board members beside her began whispering to each other, flipping through papers that suddenly looked thin. The unity that had framed them minutes earlier dissolved into scattered glances and defensive shrugs. Then Thomas spoke again, louder this time. Motion to remove the board for financial mismanagement. The words landed like a gavel strike of their own. For a half second, no one reacted. Then a hand rose. Then another. Then a row. Oliver lifted his. Grace followed. Chairs scraped as people stood to be counted. The vote wasn't organized at first, but momentum organized it quickly. Voices shifted from questioning to declaring. Evelyn's face lost color not from shock, but from realization. The authority she relied on had never been hers alone. It had been borrowed, and now it was being reclaimed. The motion passed with a speed that felt almost unreal. The board members who had sat beside her minutes earlier avoided her gaze as they lowered their hands. Applause began in the back, hesitant at first, then louder, rolling forward until the room filled with it. The silence that once favored intimidation was replaced by sound that favored clarity. No police were needed. No dramatic exits occurred. Public exposure had done the work more thoroughly than confrontation ever could. The projector light still glowed against the wall, illuminating charts that no longer needed explanation. The meeting agenda lay forgotten on the table, its printed order replaced by a new one written collectively in real time. Evelyn gathered her papers without speaking. Her authority didn't collapse in a single moment. It dissolved piece by piece, each document, each vote, each raised hand stripping it away until nothing remained to hold it up. The board table that once looked like a line of endorsements now looked like a row of empty chairs. When the applause finally faded, the room didn't feel victorious. It felt lighter. Conversation shifted from anger to planning. Who would step in temporarily? How to review the accounts? What rules needed revision? The energy had changed from confrontation to construction. I closed the binder slowly, the weight in my hands no longer defensive but final. The conflict that began with pounding on a steel gate had ended, not with shouting or force, but with transparency projected onto a wall where everyone could see it at once. The battle was over. What remained was the quiet realization that silence had been broken, and once broken, it could not be restored. The days after the meeting felt strangely quiet. as if the neighborhood itself needed time to adjust to the sound of its own honesty. There was no dramatic fallout, no shouting in the streets, no sudden sirens. Change came in paperwork, in emails, and small notices pinned to the same bulletin board that had once labeled me a hazard. Only now the tone was different. Words like review, transparency, and correction replaced enforcement and violation. An interim board formed almost immediately. Thomas accepted a temporary position with the same calm discipline he carried into the meeting. Oliver and Grace agreed to assist with communications and record-keeping, not because they wanted power, but because they wanted fairness. Their presence shifted the atmosphere from rigid to cooperative. The first official action they took was simple and powerful. Recent fines were rescinded. Notices were voided. Apologies, written plainly without defensive language, were issued to residents who had paid out of fear rather than fault. Lydia stepped into the process quietly, reviewing transaction logs with the same steady precision she had shown at my kitchen table. Nothing about the audit was dramatic. It was methodical. Line items examined. Vendor histories compared. Totals reconciled. The purpose wasn't revenge. It was clarity. The association's finances began to look less like a weapon and more like what they should have been all along. A shared resource managed in daylight instead of shadow. I returned to my land the following weekend with a different feeling in my chest. The forest looked the same, but I no longer scanned the boundary first. I walked the trails without checking my phone. The burn plan I had filed months earlier went forward exactly as intended. Controlled lines. Proper supervision. The smoke rose straight into the morning air, and no one arrived at the gate with envelopes or cameras. The silence felt clean again, no longer edged with vigilance. Over the next few weeks, the relationship between the subdivision and my tract shifted into something almost neighborly. Written boundary confirmations were exchanged, clear and simple, signed without tension. Residents who once avoided eye contact now waved again, some even stopping by the fence to ask about the new saplings. There was no sudden friendship, but there was respect, and respect was all I had ever expected. I spent one afternoon alone on the porch with the binder resting on the table beside me. It was thick now, heavy with months of paper that once represented pressure and later became proof. Every page inside it had been necessary. Every letter, every photograph, every receipt had served a purpose. But as I looked across the rows of young pines swaying in the breeze, I realized I no longer needed it. The wood chipper sat near the shed where I processed fallen branches. I carried the binder over, flipped it open one last time, and ran my hand along the dividers. Operation Fence Line. The title had once felt defensive. Now it felt finished. I fed the first stack of pages into the machine and listened as paper turned into fragments. Not destruction. Transformation. Sheet after sheet vanished into shredded ribbons that spilled into a waiting bin. Later, I spread the shredded paper at the base of the youngest pine saplings. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. What had been used to intimidate had been turned into nourishment. What had been a record of conflict became mulch that would help something grow. The act wasn't dramatic, but it was final in a way speeches never are. The neighborhood settled into a quieter rhythm after that. Meetings became shorter. Notices became clearer. Conversations shifted from compliance to cooperation. The sense of being watched faded into the background where it belonged. My land returned to what it had always been meant to be, not a battleground, not a statement, just soil and trees and wind moving through branches. I learned something I hadn't expected from the entire ordeal. Intimidation thrives in confusion, but it weakens in the presence of simple, organized truth. Documentation is not anger. It is memory with structure. And when memory is structured, it becomes something harder to dismiss than any raised voice. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the tree line and the air cooled, I stood at the edge of the eastern fence and looked toward the subdivision. Porch lights blinked on in staggered rhythm instead of perfect synchronization. It felt human again. Imperfect. Real. Peace didn't return all at once. It returned gradually, like light through leaves. My land was finally just land again. Not a line to defend, not a claim to argue, but a sanctuary reclaimed through patience and clarity. If you want to hear more true stories like this, Make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?